Okay, so I have more or less completed the rolling chassis for my Kyosho Pro Xrt, and I've also completed a rolling chassis build for an Outlaw Rampage Pro electric conversion. So this is basically the truck version of my Rampage Pro E buggy, and it's essentially the nitro version of the Pro Xrt. So this would be a mid-motor truck, Kyosho vintage truck, and this would be the rear motor configuration for the Kyosho vintage truck for the Pro X and Rampage type platform. I think when I finished the part 1 of this build video, I talked about using associated turnbuckles and ball cups or ball studs and RPM ball cups. And that's what I decided to do for the Pro Xrt, and you can use essentially the T4 long turnbuckles for the steering links with the standard shank RPM ball cups, and then for the front camber link you can use shorter. I think this is like a 2-inch turnbuckle with the RPM long shank ball cups, and this fits well enough, and it gives you room to adjust for camber in the event that, for example, you want to use the outer hull for more camber gain. Then you have to shrink, make the links smaller, so that gives you some adjustability here, or some room for that. And then on the rear I use the same turnbuckle size. Again, I think it's a 2-inch, but I use the standard length RPM ball cups, okay, because I'm using, I think this is the stock setting for the Pro Xrt rear hub carrier, this upper inner hole on the hub carrier, and then the I think it's the second row up, and then the innermost hole for the inner part of the link here on the bulkhead. So this is a shorter link than what you have up front, and so you need the short ball cups in that case in order to cover this smaller amount of space. If you need to use a low camber gain setting, your lowest setting would basically be to move this ball stud out here. This is threaded in enough such that you can unthread it and not have to worry about completely threading it out in order to cover this longer length here for the rear. Okay, and that's basically it for this. There's a little detail I want to get to about the RPM ball cups. I get to that in a moment, but I just want to briefly, let me find a place to put this. Put there. I'll just briefly go over the Outlaw Rampage Pro E electric truck conversion. Essentially, I did pretty much the same thing here as I did with the buggy version. The only difference is on the gearbox. I had a bit more trouble with this specific gearbox getting it to mesh smoothly. When I built the buggy, used the same exact gearbox, same part numbers and everything, but it spun more freely than this particular one. So I guess these Kyosho SST gearboxes have a bit more variation from lot to lot or part to part. So in this case, I played a different trick in order to free up the gearbox. I actually made a separate video about that, so I suggest you just go check that out. I won't waste your time re-describing those details here. Same type of motor plate, same modification here for the middle chassis brace, using an RC10B4 carbon fiber battery brace and cutting it to fit, and then drilling an extra hole here and here so that I can screw in these 3 screws, and now I have a center chassis brace, which when combined with this little tie rod here eliminates chassis flex in the longitudinal direction. If you want some chassis flex, maybe you can put a little spring in here, or like a tiny little shock there, or maybe you can put a friction plate here or something like that. I haven't really considered going that advanced with the center brace. I just want to keep it stiff and fixed because I have to slot the battery underneath this, and I don't want any movement going on around here. In this instance, instead of using the associated turnbuckles, I just used Lunsford Punisher titanium turnbuckles. I just had them lying around, and they are slightly different lengths. So the rear length here is a 48mm turnbuckle, and I used the RPM standard or short ball cups. And then up front here, I think this is something like a 52mm, and this is maybe like a 56mm or so turnbuckle. Both of them use the long shank RPM ball cups in order to make the correct length for the steering links and the camber links. Now, one thing that you'll find is if you take this approach with the RPM ball cups, they are a little bit fatter, so that does limit you in a few ways. I described, I think previously, how because these are fatter, you cannot use the high roll center setting for the inner camber link ball stud mounting point, which means the lower row of holes here you cannot use, because that'll put this ball cup too close to the inner steering link ball cup, and they'll rub together as the steering moves around. So really you're limited to this middle hole, this middle row, or this upper row of holes. Okay, so that's limitation number one. Number two is that the ball cup will actually rub against the inner edge of the front wheel. If the wheel's not turning at all, if it's pointed straight, it'll actually rotate okay. The problem is, as you steer the wheel, it binds with this ball cup, and so you can't quite get full steering lock before the ball cup starts to touch the inside of the steering wheel. Maybe it's a little bit more visible here, so you can see it's more or less clear, and then as I steer the wheel, you see the ball cup start to touch the inside of the wheel there. And full lock would mean that the inside surface of the steering knuckle touches the caster block here, and I don't quite get there with this essentially thicker ball cup. So you have to remember that on these Pro X style steering links, you have two holes for the ball cup placement, and in the original manual it actually tells you to cut out the outer hole and mount the ball stud on the inner hole. And what I did with these is the exact opposite. I actually screwed the ball studs into the outermost hole, and if you do that, then you have this clearance issue. I'm pretty sure that if you instead put these ball studs into the innermost hole, okay, so this is a particular unit where the outermost hole, you can kind of see a remnant of it here, was cut out. That's where I have my ball studs now on these guys. But if instead you mount it on the innermost hole, then you should, I think you'll get enough clearance to get full steering lock with these thicker RPM ball cups. And what ends up happening, I think, is when you use that innermost hole, is it does change the Ackerman a little bit. So that would mean that this side, the outer wheel, goes out more, and this one goes in more. So I think it reduces the amount of Ackerman you have, I think. So it will change the steering geometry a little bit. But then again, the manual, the build manual actually calls for that as the baseline setup for these steering knuckles. So you're not actually really doing anything wrong by setting it up that way. Okay, the other thing I wanted to talk about briefly are the wheels. For the Pro Xrt in particular, wheels are really hard to find, and when they do show up on eBay, they tend to be rather expensive. So I'd been thinking about potential substitutes for these wheels if you wanted to, find parts that presently exist, modern parts that you can use to substitute for these wheels. So for the front wheels, What you can use are Traxxas Rustler front wheels. That's TRA 1974. I don't have them mounted on either of the left or right here, but this particular wheel, actually, let me just right here, this wheel right here, okay, if you mount the wheel such that what would normally be the outside of the wheel actually faces inwards like this, then you'll actually get pretty darn close to the correct width for the front of the truck. So this is actually a really good substitute for the front wheels for the Pro Xrt and the Outlaw Rampage Pro. You just have to mount them essentially inside out, because normally on the Rustler, this part of the wheel is the inside, so you would mount it this way, but that would make the front too wide. These Pro Xrt wheels have a deep offset, so you actually have to mount them the other way, okay, outside in, to get the correct offset. All that means is that this side will end up facing the outside, and so you don't have a nice clean dish, if you will, facing the outside. So if you don't really care about the aesthetics, this is actually a pretty good substitute that you can buy for, you know, relatively cheaply. They still make these for the front wheels. For the rear wheels, it's a little bit trickier. So on the left here, I have the original Pro Xrt wheel, and on the right, I have the Traxxas Rustler rear wheel. Okay, so that's TRA, I think 1972 instead of 1974. Now the hex placement on this Traxxas wheel is different than it is on the Kyosho wheel. The offset is different. So what that essentially means is that if you mount this Rustler wheel, this Traxxas wheel in the rear is going to be wider than if you use the Kyosho wheel by about, I would say, it's hard to see with the lighting here, but you notice the inside edge of the tire is roughly a few millimeters away from the part where the rear hub carrier kind of notches out, okay? So right where my pinky is pointing, right about there. So if I put it in better lighting, you can see it's a couple of millimeters there, maybe 2 or 3 millimeters, probably closer to 3 millimeters. Here with the Kyosho wheel, you can see the inside edge of that wheel actually overlaps that part of the rear hub carrier where it notches out. So there's about a maybe 4 or so millimeter difference in the rear track width when you go from the Kyosho wheel to the Traxxas wheel. So what that'll mean is if you use the Traxxas Rustler front and rear wheels, you have the correct front width, but the rear width will be a little bit wider. That will change the handling characteristics. It'll make the car steer a bit more, okay, which might be something you want, especially perhaps in the Pro Xrt, the rear motor configuration. The problem is it may not necessarily be a ROAR legal width for the truck, okay, so if you don't mind that, if that's not really an issue for you, then you can use that wheel. Another option would be the Team Associated T4 or T5 perhaps hex wheels. Those will also fit. You just have to remount the inside hole on those wheels because the wheel axle for the Kyosho part is a bit larger in diameter than the old Associated wheel axle. So you just remount that hole a bit, it'll slot right in, and it'll also make the rear a little bit wider, so it's kind of similar to this Traxxas part in that sense. But that's another option you can use. I haven't yet found a rear hex wheel that has the correct hex offset so that you can replicate the rear track width using as if you would be using the original Kyosho wheels. So for the time being, again, either the Associated wheels or the Traxxas wheels, those will work technically, but they won't be the right width. The only other manufacturers for truck wheels would be Team Losi, and I think they have about the same wheel offset as the Associated wheels, so it's probably no difference there. And I know X-Ray makes a carpet truck, so those hexes I think are 14 millimeter though, so you need to get a 14 millimeter hex adapter, and again, I don't know what the offsets are on those wheels, so I haven't tried all the truck wheels, but from what I've tried so far, this is what I got. Okay, so I don't want to keep rambling about wheels, but I know that these are really hard to find. The original Kyosho wheels So I want to give you guys some options here. That's pretty much it as far as these builds go. Of course, I have to install electronics in both of these. I have to paint and mount bodies. The bodies are also really hard to find for these trucks. I do have one body, but I don't want to send it out to get reproduced because it would be very expensive to do so. I'm pretty sure it would be. So instead, I'm going to try to use the Kyosho RT5 body on the Pro Xrt. I think it'll fit. It's a modern body, but I'm pretty sure it'll fit. And then for the mid-motor truck, I found an X-Factory truck body, mid-motor truck body that I think will fit on this just fine. Another option, actually, would be to use the RC10 GT or GT2 body, and if you cut the holes correctly, this will also fit almost perfectly. So that's another option if you want like a more vintage-like body for the mid-motor configuration. I may also do that instead of the X-Factory body. Is there anything else I want to cover? Nope, I think that's it. So that's it for now at least. So thanks for watching.